A janitor's daughter sat silently in a lecture hall and checkmated a millionaire CEO in just 4 moves. But what he did next changed both their lives forever. Boston was still drowsy in the quiet hush of early morning. In the glass and steel towers of the financial district, most lights were off, except for the few offices where work never truly ended. At 6:12 a.m., Grace Bennett pushed her cleaning cart through the revolving doors of Aldridge Innovations, one of the city's most powerful tech companies. She wore old sneakers with flattened soles and a sweatshirt 2 sizes too large, her hair pulled back under a gray cap. She didn't mind being invisible. In fact, she preferred it. On the executive floor, silence was law, and janitors like her were expected to move like shadows, efficient, invisible, and gone before the first coffee brewed. But today was different. School was closed, and Grace had no choice but to bring her daughter, 7-year-old Sophie, with her. The little girl sat curled on the floor near the large lobby windows, a tattered spiral notebook balanced on her lap. Her black curls fell gently around her face as she drew lines and curves, shapes and patterns. Not cartoons, not princesses, but geometric structures that somehow balanced logic and beauty. No one had taught her this. It was simply how Sophie saw the world. "I'll only be a few minutes," Grace whispered as she reached for the glass door to the CEO's office. "Just stay right there. Don't touch anything, okay?" Sophie nodded, eyes still glued to her notebook. She was used to it, used to being quiet, to waiting, to fitting into her mother's long, exhausted hours. Inside, Grace moved with practiced speed, wiping windows, straightening chairs, and polishing the walnut desk that looked out over Boston Harbor. The office smelled like expensive leather and silence. Everything gleamed. But Sophie's attention had shifted. Her pencil rested beside her notebook as her eyes locked on something in the corner of the room, a wooden chessboard. The pieces stood frozen mid-game, as if paused in the middle of a grand battle. The carving on each figure was intricate and clearly handcrafted. But it wasn't the artistry that caught Sophie's attention. It was the position. She stood up slowly, drawn to the board like a magnet. She didn't touch anything. She simply stared. The white queen was exposed. One move, just one, and the black knight could leap to F3, threatening both queen and rook in a perfect fork. She tilted her head, thoughtful. Behind her, the door opened. "I forgot the—" The voice cut off. Ethan Caldwell, 34, CEO of Aldridge Innovations, stepped into the room in a tailored charcoal suit, his coat unbuttoned, a folder in one hand. He expected an empty office. He did not expect a little girl standing quietly at his chessboard, eyes narrowed in analytical silence. Grace gasped from across the room and nearly dropped her cloth. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm so sorry. The school's closed today, and I didn't have anyone—" Ethan held up a hand. "It's all right." He looked at the child again. "Does she play chess?" "No," Grace said, glancing nervously at Sophie. "She just likes shapes. She draws them all the time." He crouched beside the board. "Do you like chess?" he asked gently. Sophie finally looked up. Her voice was small but certain. "The white queen is in danger. If the black knight goes to F3, it forks the queen and the rook." Ethan blinked. He turned to the board. She was absolutely right. He stared at the little girl for a long moment, then slowly sat down on the floor across from her. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. Sophie shrugged. "It just makes sense. Knights move in L shapes." Grace stepped forward. flustered. "She's never played before, I swear. We can't afford lessons or anything like that." Ethan didn't respond. He simply studied Sophie's face, the stillness in her expression, the way her eyes flicked from one piece to another with quiet confidence. "Would you like to learn how to play?" he asked. Sophie's eyes widened, not in delight, but in hunger. A deep, quiet hunger to understand, to be understood. She nodded, and just like that, something shifted in the air. Grace didn't know what had just happened, only that she felt like she had witnessed a door quietly open in the fabric of the world, and her daughter had stepped through it. 3 days later, Ethan cleared part of his calendar. Sophie returned to his office after school, now with a visitor badge clipped to her coat and a designated hour blocked off every Tuesday and Thursday. The janitor's daughter had become the most anticipated meeting in the building. They started simple. He explained the names of the pieces, how they moved, the importance of the center, the value of space. Within 20 minutes, she was asking questions about initiative, tempo, and piece development, things some adults never fully grasp. She didn't learn like a beginner. She played like someone remembering something she had always known. That night, in his penthouse overlooking Beacon Hill, Ethan sat alone with a glass of scotch untouched on the table beside him. The city glittered below like a circuit board. "If the knight goes to F3, it forks the queen and the rook." The words echoed in his mind. He stared at the empty board across the room and smiled, not with pride, but with awe. Then he picked up his phone. "Ben," he said when the voice answered. "Remember how you said you wanted to coach the next Bobby Fischer?" He paused, the corners of his mouth lifting. "I think I've found something even better." Boston glowed under the cold light of a late afternoon sky as Grace stepped once again into the towering lobby of Aldridge Innovations, her 4th time this month. But this time she wasn't pushing a mop cart. She was simply following behind her daughter Sophie and standing quietly outside the CEO's office like a mother on the edge of a world her child had already stepped into. Inside, Ethan Caldwell had cleared the conference table and laid out the same wooden chessboard Sophie had silently observed the first day. He no longer wore the cool armor of a tech executive. Today, he was just a man with a question in his chest. Could genius really be born in the places nobody thinks to look? Sophie sat across from him, elbows off the table, posture neat and focused. Her eyes scanned the board like a conductor scanning a score. "Pawn to E4, she whispered. Ethan smiled. Controlling the center. Bold choice. The air between them pulsed with quiet intention. He moved his pawn in response, and the game began. Grace hovered at the threshold, clutching her worn handbag. She had never seen her daughter like this, focused, alive, almost radiant. At school, Sophie was the child who sat alone during recess, always drawing, always quiet. Teachers called her distant or socially delayed. But here in front of this board, she wasn't delayed at all. Ethan leaned in. "Remember what I told you about the center?" Sophie nodded. "If I control the center, I control the game." "Exactly," he said. Then, without hesitation, she moved her knight. By the third move, Ethan saw it, the trap she was setting. 3 weeks later, Ethan handed Grace a dark blue bag. Inside, a regulation chess set, a tournament clock, and a notation journal. "This is for Sophie," he said gently. Grace stared at it like he had placed a diamond in her hands. "We can't accept this," she whispered. "I don't have a way to—" "It's not a gift," Ethan interrupted. "It's an investment in something real." The word investment rang in Grace's chest like a forgotten prayer. No one had ever used that word when speaking about her daughter. At school, Sophie was the quiet one, the odd one, the one who needed extra help. But here she was being spoken of in a language reserved for people with futures. One Friday afternoon, Grace arrived early to pick her up and stopped cold at the door. Sophie and Ethan were laughing. He was using his fingers to act out a knight's gallop. "The knight hops all the way to F7. Sophie giggled, eyes sparkling. "Checkmate." Ethan froze. He looked down at the board, then at Sophie. She had beaten him. 6 moves, a clean win, no mistakes. And he hadn't gone easy on her. Grace stepped inside. Ethan looked up, visibly shaken. "Has she studied with anyone before?" "No," Grace said. "We don't even own a chess book." That night, as the subway groaned through the worn-out buildings of Dorchester, Sophie clutched the blue chess bag like it was made of gold. "He said I have natural spatial intuition," she murmured. Grace didn't understand the phrase, but she understood the tone. Her daughter, for the first time in her life, had been called brilliant. After Sophie went to bed, Grace sat on the threadbare couch, laptop balanced on her knees. She typed, "Young chess prodigies." The screen filled with stories. Pictures of tiny kids holding giant trophies, academies, coaches, national tournaments, flights, fees. And then she slowly closed the laptop. It felt like standing before a golden gate, holding no key. "Don't dream too high, Gracie," she whispered. "Not again." But across the city, in a penthouse overlooking Beacon Hill, Ethan stared at the chessboard where he'd been outplayed by a 7-year-old, and he didn't feel defeated. He felt awake. Late that night, he sat alone in a quiet cafe, phone pressed to his ear. "Ben," he said when the voice answered. "Remember when you told me you wanted to train the next Bobby Fischer?" A pause, a soft chuckle. "The girl again?" "She checkmated me today. 6 moves. Another pause. "You want me to meet her?" "I need you to," Ethan replied. "Because if we don't do something soon, the world out there is going to swallow her whole." The rain came down in thin, steady lines that blurred the skyline of Boston, softening the edges of its towering steel and glass. Inside the quiet of the 23rd floor, where decisions worth millions were made daily, a different kind of moment was unfolding. One that no algorithm could measure and no executive could predict. Sophie sat at the long table in the center of the boardroom, her legs too short to reach the floor. Her small hands rested on the edge of the polished surface, eyes focused not on the view but on the chessboard that had been carefully placed before her. Opposite her sat a man with silver hair and the kind of stillness that came from decades of calculation. Benjamin Adler, former U.S. chess champion, international finalist, and a coach whispered about in elite circles, was here for one reason: curiosity. Ethan Caldwell rarely called in favors, and never for anything trivial. But this little girl had sparked something in him. Ben expected a child, perhaps clever, perhaps precocious, certainly inexperienced. He was prepared to indulge Ethan's request with a kind smile and a quick draw. But Sophie did not giggle. She did not ask for snacks or fidget in her seat. She looked directly at him and said, "Do you prefer white or black?" Ben raised an eyebrow. "I like to see what my opponent chooses." "I'll take black," she replied. "I want to see your opening." And just like that, the room changed. Ethan, leaning quietly in the corner, crossed his arms. He had seen this before. The shift, the way Sophie's eyes turned sharper when she sat before a chessboard. It was the only time she looked like she truly belonged. Ben opened with pawn to d4. Classical, strong. Sophie responded with d5. The opening was familiar, but what followed was anything but ordinary. Ben probed her understanding with subtle traps. A knight's sacrifice, a bishop's feint, the illusion of tempo. Sophie met each move with precision. No wasted time, no hesitation. She played like someone who had been here before, not in years, but in soul. 37 moves in. They were deep into the middle game. Balanced, tense, neither side faltering. Ben sat back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Where did you learn this?"
"Here,"
Sophie answered, nodding toward Ethan.
"And from looking at games online. Sometimes. I just look at a position and I know what it wants."
Ben blinked. The phrasing was familiar, eerily so. Years ago, in a cold hall in Moscow, a 9-year-old prodigy had said something almost identical. That boy had become a grandmaster at 10. He studied her face for a moment longer, then reached across the board. "Draw?" Sophie glanced at the position, tilted her head. She could push. The game wasn't lost. But she nodded and shook his hand. "Draw." Ben smiled. Truly smiled this time. "You're not just talented. You're different." Sophie looked back at the board. "I like how quiet it gets when the game makes sense." Behind her, Ethan exhaled slowly. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. Later that evening, Grace stood in their small kitchen in Dorchester, stirring a pot of lentils on the stove. The apartment smelled faintly of cleaning supplies. The radiator ticked rhythmically like an old metronome. Sophie sat at the table, scribbling chess notations in a new spiral notebook Ethan had given her. Grace turned down the heat, watching her daughter in the fading light.
"Did you have fun today?"
Sophie didn't look up.
"The man with the white hair plays like you clean."
Grace blinked.
"What does that mean?"
"Quiet, focused.
Everything goes in the right place, but not boring."
Grace smiled, turning away quickly before her eyes betrayed her. She didn't always understand what Sophie meant, but lately she was starting to understand what Sophie needed. Not noise, not comfort, but clarity. And maybe someone who believed in her before the world demanded proof. The next morning, Ethan called. "I want to enter Sophie into a junior regional tournament," he said. "It's in 2 weeks. Ben will coach her. We'll cover everything. No strings attached." Grace hesitated. She's never even competed. She's never even been inside a club. "She's ready," Ethan said, "and she needs to see what's possible." There was silence on the line. Then Grace replied, steady but firm. "Only if I go with her." "Of course," Ethan said. "You're her queen, the most important piece on the board." That caught her off guard. She hadn't been called important in years. They left for Philadelphia the following Thursday. The city pulsed with a different rhythm. Faster, louder, sharper. Sophie held her chess bag like a passport. Grace sat beside her on the train, the weight of this new world pressing into her chest. The hotel was a whirl of badges, lanyards, and laminated schedules. Kids in polos shouted opening names like battle cries. Grace felt entirely out of place. Sophie did not. She spent an hour in the hotel lobby watching other children play blitz games. She didn't approach. She didn't blink. She simply observed, still as glass, absorbing everything. That night, over takeout in their room, Ben arrived with a folder. "I checked the pairings. Sophie's opponent is ranked 8th nationally under 10, 3-time state winner, plays aggressive, overextends." Sophie listened, silent. "So I wait," she said. Ben smiled.
Exactly. Grace said nothing, but inside her stomach churned. Tomorrow, her daughter wouldn't be coddled. No one would pause to translate her silence into kindness. She would be treated not as a child, not as special, but as a player. And she would have to prove she belonged. The next morning, the tournament hall buzzed with fluorescent light and the nervous energy of first rounds. Sophie stood beside her board, her name clipped crookedly to her sweater. Across from her sat a boy twice her size, tapping his fingers, smirking already. The judge raised a hand. "You may begin." Sophie moved first, pawn to e4. The boy answered with a loud clack, pawn to c5. The Sicilian defense, sharp, fast, brutal. Ben leaned forward. Ethan stood behind him, motionless. Grace clasped her hands so tightly they ached. Sophie developed her knight, then her bishop. On the fourth move, she looked up and smiled. Not shyly, not nervously, but with the calm, unshaken gaze of someone who knew exactly what the board wanted. The tournament hall hummed with the low-frequency noise of shuffling chairs, whispered calculations, and the soft tick of dozens of clocks counting down dreams. To most, it was just another room. To Sophie, it was a battlefield. Her small hands rested on the edge of the board. Across from her sat Liam Anderson, 9 years old, sharp-tongued, and already draped in the smug confidence that came with trophies and newspaper clippings. His coach stood behind the velvet ropes, arms crossed, nodding like a man watching his investment perform as expected. The clock started. Sophie opened quietly. Pawn to e4. Liam responded instantly. Sicilian defense. Pawn to c5. His pieces snapped onto squares like drum beats. Deliberate, loud, meant to intimidate. Sophie didn't blink. She developed slowly. Knight, bishop, castle. She avoided traps not through memorization, but by instinct. Ethan watched from the gallery, fingers clenched. He knew the Sicilian, knew its sharp corners and sharp players. Sophie was swimming in deep water now. Liam leaned forward after his 10th move. "You're slow," he said, loud enough for 2 other boards to turn. Sophie looked up, not confused, not offended, just still. Then she reached forward and played queen to d3, a move so quiet, so strategic, Liam didn't see it for what it was. He smirked. "You're gonna lose on time." And for the first time, Sophie's hands trembled. It was barely visible. But Grace, watching from the back of the room, saw it like lightning. Her daughter was unraveling, not because of the board, but because of the noise. The way the boy's presence filled the space, the pressure of eyes, the ticking of expectation. Sophie pressed the clock. It ticked louder than ever. She had 12 minutes left. Liam had 18. He attacked. She responded. But her movements grew slower. By move 28, Sophie was behind. Not in position. In seconds. Her brow furrowed. Her fingers hovered before landing. She was thinking, but the tournament wasn't asking her to think. It was asking her to perform. Ben murmured to Ethan, "She's not used to the clock." "She's used to silence," Ethan whispered back. "To space." "She needs to make a choice," Ben said, almost to himself. "Play the game she sees, or play the game they demand." Liam pushed a pawn to d5, an aggressive attempt to open her center. Sophie's hand froze above the board. 10. 9. Then she moved. Knight to e5. It was bold, unorthodox, but it created a fork. Liam hadn't seen it coming. He cursed under his breath. Ethan sat up straighter. The next 5 moves unraveled like music. Strange music, composed in a key only Sophie understood. She sacrificed a bishop no one expected. She allowed an open file. Then, out of nowhere, she began weaving a net. Ben's lips parted. She's building a trap. Liam flinched. His queen was pinned, his rook exposed. He tried to counter. He overreached. Sophie responded with rook to g7. A gasp rippled through the front row. Grace's hands flew to her mouth. Liam stared at the board. He had lost, and he knew it. Sophie didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply looked at the judge and whispered, "Checkmate." There was silence. Then the judge nodded, pressed the clock, and announced the result. The scoreboard lit up. Sophie Bennett, win. Liam stormed off, his coach following with tight-lipped fury. But Sophie didn't even look after him. She turned to her mother and ran. Grace met her halfway, kneeling to the ground, catching her in an embrace that smelled of sweat, nerves, and something deeper. Victory that wasn't just about the board. "I was scared," Sophie whispered. "I know," Grace said, smoothing her daughter's curls. "But you were brave. I didn't like the ticking. You didn't let it stop you." Ethan approached quietly. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed the storm behind them. "You didn't just win," he said. "You adapted." Sophie looked up at him. "I didn't know what to do at first, but then I stopped trying to play fast and just played honest." Ben arrived last, arms folded, smiling like a man who had seen something holy. "I've coached for 30 years, he said, "and I've never seen a kid recover like that." Sophie looked confused. "Recover from what?" Ben chuckled. "Exactly." That night, back in the hotel, Sophie sat at the small desk in the corner of their room, her chess notebook open, scribbling down every move from memory. Grace watched from the bed, a quiet smile on her face. "She's not just smart," she said aloud. "She's something else," Ethan replied from the armchair. "Different," Grace said. "No," Ethan said gently. "Rare." They were silent for a moment. Then Grace added, "This doesn't change our life, you know. We still live in Dorchester. I still mop floors. And next week, she'll still be the quiet kid who no one understands at school." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's time the world starts understanding her, on her terms." Grace didn't respond right away, but her eyes softened. "Don't make promises you can't keep, Ethan." "I won't," he said. Then softly, "But maybe I can keep the ones nobody else has dared to make." Monday morning returned to Boston like fog rolling over the harbor, slow, gray, and indifferent. Back in Dorchester, Sophie sat at the corner of the kitchen table with a bowl of oatmeal cooling beside her, her mind already far from breakfast. She was reviewing her own moves from the tournament on a tiny notepad, recreating each position from memory. Grace moved quietly around the apartment, checking her phone every few minutes. The landlord had left a voicemail, something about the heating again. Rent was due in 6 days. She would need to pick up an extra shift tonight. Again. Then her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. "Hello? Hi, this is Natalie Brooks from the Boston Globe. I'm looking for Grace Bennett. Sophie's mother?" Grace hesitated. "This is she." "I'd love to schedule a short interview with you and Sophie. Her performance in the Philadelphia Youth Open was extraordinary. Her name's already trending in some online forums. A 7-year-old with no formal training beating a ranked player in 30 moves. It's quite a story." Grace's stomach nodded. "Who gave you this number?" There was a pause. "Mr. Ethan Caldwell. He's listed as a sponsor on the registration." Grace pressed her fingers to her forehead. "We're not comfortable with press." "I understand," Natalie said gently. "But this isn't about putting pressure on Sophie. It's about showing what brilliance looks like in unexpected places. People need stories like hers." Grace didn't know what to say. Sophie had never asked for attention. She just wanted to play. But was it right to keep her in the shadows? "Let me talk to her," Grace said. Sophie, when asked, didn't hesitate. "Only if I can talk about the board. Not about me." 2 days later, they met in a small cafe near Copley Square. Natalie Brooks was young, warm, and had the kind of smile that made people feel they were already old friends. She had once covered politics, then education, but lately found herself writing profiles about small wonders, people whose stories didn't shake governments, but changed lives. Sophie sat across from her, sipping hot chocolate. She was polite but distant, her answers short, factual. Natalie scribbled fast. "Do you remember the exact moment you realized you were winning?" Sophie shook her head. "I don't think about winning. I think about the shape of the board, when the pieces feel balanced." Natalie blinked. "That's poetic." Sophie frowned. "It's just the truth." Later, when the photographer came in, Sophie flinched at the flash. Grace wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Maybe just one more," she said gently. The article published 2 days later under the headline, "The Girl Who Hears the Board, Boston's Quiet Prodigy." It was meant to be simple, a feel-good piece. But in a city still reeling from inequality, underfunded schools, and widening gaps between tech elites and working families, Sophie's story caught fire. She wasn't from Cambridge. She wasn't from a private academy. She was from a 2-room apartment in Dorchester, the daughter of a janitor, learning chess between mop buckets and broken radiators. And suddenly, everyone wanted a piece of her. The offers came in waves: scholarship proposals, interviews, private coaches. A national prep academy from New Jersey called. So did a tech-backed nonprofit in Silicon Valley that ran a genius incubator. Ethan's inbox flooded. "Let her come stay for a month. We'll evaluate her cognitive profile. We can pay for relocation. We can make her the face of our new campaign on underrepresented, gifted youth." One email even proposed turning Sophie into a human interest documentary. Ethan read them all, then deleted them one by one. He had seen what happened when institutions turned children into projects. They measured their genius in metrics, mapped their brains, monetized their potential. Then, when the child burned out or broke down, they moved on, to the next headline. He remembered something Sophie had said after her first match. "I didn't play to win. I played honest." The world didn't reward honesty, but maybe someone needed to protect it. Still, the spotlight had already spilled over. At school, Sophie found herself surrounded by kids who had never spoken to her before. Some praised her, others stared. One boy said she cheated. Another said she was just lucky. A third tried to play chess with her during lunch and cried when she beat him in 6 moves. Sophie stopped bringing her chess set to school. At home, Grace found a new letter under their apartment door. Rent increase, effective immediately. She placed the letter on the counter and stared at it until the words blurred. Later that evening, she found Sophie sitting alone in the hallway, notebook on her knees, the pages blank.
"You okay?"
Grace asked, kneeling beside her.
"I don't like being seen."
Grace wrapped her arms around her daughter.
"I know, baby. But being seen isn't always bad."
Sophie's voice trembled.
"I liked it better when it was just me. And the board."
That same night, Ethan visited his mother's grave for the first time in months. He stood in silence, hands in pockets, the winter air raw against his skin. The cemetery was empty, just rows of names and stories too short.
"I don't know what I'm doing," he whispered. "I thought I could fix this. Help her. But maybe I'm making it worse."
He crouched down, brushed a few leaves off the stone.
"She reminds me of me," he admitted. "Except she's unbroken. And I'm afraid the world's going to change that."
He stayed until the sun dipped below the horizon. Then he stood, took a breath, and made a decision. The next morning, Ethan walked into Sophie's apartment building and knocked. Grace opened the door, surprised. She hadn't expected to see him without a call first. He stepped inside quietly. "I want to make an offer," he said. Grace folded her arms. "If it's about a scholarship, we're not interested." "It's not," he replied. "It's a contract. 1 year. I'll fund a custom curriculum. Coaches, travel, living expenses. But Sophie stays here. No press, no relocation, no sponsors. Just time. To learn. To grow. On her terms." Grace stared at him.
"Why?"
"Because I think the world will eat her alive if we don't slow it down." She studied his face. There was no sales pitch, no ego, just concern. And something deeper, guilt. She nodded once. But Sophie, listening from the hallway, stepped forward. "Can I still be invisible sometimes?" she asked. Ethan knelt to her level. "You can be anything you want, Sophie." She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. That night, as the city exhaled beneath the weight of its own noise, a small apartment in Dorchester flickered with the sound of clock ticks and scribbled notes. Sophie played a match against herself, white versus black, silently exploring the choices she hadn't made that day. Grace made tea. The radiator groaned, and Ethan sat on the floor beside her, a blank notebook in his lap, not to teach, but to learn. From a girl who didn't want to be a star, only a player, with space and silence and time. The invitation came in a plain white envelope, slid under Ethan's office door like a whisper from the past. At first, he didn't open it. He knew the handwriting, knew the paper stock, the embossed seal, an invitation to the annual New England Tech Leaders Summit at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. The very place where Ethan Caldwell's name had once been synonymous with brilliance, innovation, and ambition. But ambition had a cost. And the man who used to own rooms like that wasn't the same man who now spent his evenings kneeling beside a 7-year-old girl, sketching rooks and pawns in the margins of grocery receipts. Still, that world hadn't forgotten him. Not yet. So, 3 nights later, Ethan walked into the gallery beneath the soaring glass atrium, the clinking of champagne glasses ringing in his ears like bells at a funeral. He wore his sharpest suit, not to impress, but as armor. Men nodded, women smiled with the edge of memory, and someone whispered, "He used to be the one to watch." Ethan smiled tightly and moved past them. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there to find her. He spotted her near the far wall, perfectly poised in a navy blue dress, her posture so elegant, It bordered on theatrical. Madeline Crane, head of Crane Technologies, his former partner, and the woman who once tried to merge not just companies, but lives. She turned before he could speak. "Ethan," she said softly, like the word was an old song. "It's been too long." He nodded. 3 years. 4, she corrected, but I've stopped counting. He glanced at the display behind her, a series of abstract paintings on neural networks and cognition. She always had a flair for pairing intelligence with beauty. "You're still curating the gala?" he asked. "I'm still curating everything," she replied, smiling faintly. "Including you, which is why I wanted to see you." Ethan hesitated. "You've read the article." Madeline tilted her head. "The girl, Sophie." He didn't answer. "I know brilliance when I see it," she continued. "And I know you, Ethan. You're not investing in a portfolio anymore. You're protecting her." His jaw tightened. "She's not a project." "No," Madeline said. "She's a mirror." They stood in silence. Around them, people discussed IPOs and AI ethics, but for Ethan, the room felt like glass, clear and cold. "I'd like to meet her," Madeline added. "No cameras, just a conversation. I run a gifted division now. She could—" "No," Ethan cut in. "You're making her small." "I'm letting her breathe." Madeline's smile faded. "That girl is fire, and you're putting her in a box." "I'm giving her time," he said quietly. "Something no one gave me." Madeline's expression changed. Not anger, not condescension, regret. "You walked away from the world, Ethan." He met her gaze. "No. I walked toward something better." Meanwhile, across the city, Grace tucked Sophie into bed. The apartment buzzed with a quiet rhythm, the hum of the fridge, the rustle of notebook pages. Sophie had started drawing chess puzzles in colored pencil, red for sacrifices, blue for traps. She worked in silence, her brow furrowed. "Can I ask you something?" she said suddenly. "Of course," Grace replied. "Why do people want me to win all the time?" Grace sat down at the edge of the bed. "Because most people don't understand joy unless it comes with a prize." "But I don't play for prizes." "I know, sweetheart. That's what makes you different." Sophie looked out the window. "I don't want to lose the board." Grace didn't know what she meant. Not fully, but she knew that look in her daughter's eyes, that flicker of fear, of becoming something the world wanted instead of staying who she already was. "You won't lose it," she whispered. "Not while I'm here." Sophie nodded, and for the first time in days, she closed her eyes without tension. The next morning, Ethan returned to Dorchester with a quiet storm behind his eyes. Grace opened the door before he knocked. "She's drawing positions," she said. "Come in." He stepped inside, sat cross-legged on the floor beside Sophie. She looked up from her sketchbook. "Did you see paintings?" He nodded. "I did." "Were they like chessboards?" "More like questions without answers." Sophie considered this. "Then I wouldn't like them." He smiled. "I didn't either." She looked back at her drawing. "Are you sad?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "I'm tired of rooms full of people pretending to care." Sophie placed her hand gently over his. "Then stay in rooms with people who don't have to pretend." He closed his eyes for a moment. She was 7. and somehow she saw straight through him. That night, a storm swept over Boston. Not violent, but unrelenting. Grace sat at the window, watching the streetlights shimmer in puddles. Ethan stood beside her, cup of coffee in hand. "She's changing me," he said. Grace didn't look away from the glass. "She changes everyone. The difference is, you're letting it happen." He was quiet for a while. Then, "Madeline wants to meet her." Grace's voice dropped. "Why?" "Because people like her don't believe in silence. They believe in acceleration." Grace turned to face him. "And you?" "I believe Sophie's gift doesn't belong to a foundation or a boardroom. It belongs to her." He placed a document on the table, a check, a new one, more zeros, but also something else, a promise. "I want to help you move," he said. "A bigger place, more light, no strings." Grace stared at it. She didn't want charity. But she also didn't want Sophie growing up watching mold creep up the walls. She nodded slowly. "We accept, but only if you come for dinner once a week." He blinked. "Why?" "Because I want Sophie to grow up knowing the people who believe in her sit at the table, not behind glass." Ethan swallowed hard. "Deal," he said. They shook on it. And in that tiny kitchen, under a flickering light bulb and a leaky faucet, a new kind of contract was born. Not legal, not financial, just human. The envelope arrived, folded into Sophie's chess notebook. Not mailed, not messaged, hand-delivered, cream cardstock, gold trim, and one crisp sentence embossed in the center. "You are formally invited to the National Chess Exhibition in Washington, D.C. No rankings, no sponsors. Just 12 players hand-picked by grandmasters and world champions to participate in an elite showcase." At first, Grace mistook it for junk. But Ben Adler, now sitting in their Dorchester apartment sipping mint tea, held the letter like sacred scripture. "This," he said, tapping the paper, "isn't an opportunity. It's a stage." Ethan stood by the window, arms crossed, staring out at the rows of red brick buildings. "She's not ready." Ben glanced up. "She beat 2 ranked juniors last week." "That's not what I mean," Ethan muttered. "The cameras, the interviews, the pressure." Grace folded the invitation and set it on the table. "They say it's optional?" Ben nodded. "Entirely. But if she plays, it will change everything." Later that night, Ethan sat across from Sophie at their usual corner table. No board between them this time, just a plate of fries and 2 cups of hot chocolate. She stirred hers absently, watching the marshmallows dissolve. "Do you know what an exhibition is?" he asked. Sophie nodded. "It's not for winning, it's for showing." Ethan smiled faintly. "That's exactly right." "I don't want to perform," she said. "I just want to play." He hesitated. "This would be different. There will be lights, and people asking questions, and adults who don't understand why someone like you knows so much." Sophie was quiet. Then she said, "Will the board be the same size?" He blinked. "Yes." "Then I'll be fine." The train to Washington buzzed with quiet excitement. Grace packed peanut butter sandwiches and a thermos of mint tea. Ethan carried Sophie's new travel board. She wore her favorite gray sweater, soft, with a single blue knight embroidered on the sleeve. Ben met them at Union Station, wearing a navy cap and holding a handwritten schedule. 3 matches, 1 per day, no eliminations, just play. The exhibition was held at the Smithsonian Castle, inside an ornate hall beneath stained glass windows. Cameras lined the balcony. Grandmasters whispered into microphones for a live stream watched by tens of thousands. Sophie didn't flinch. She approached her board like she always did, quietly, directly, as if greeting an old friend. Her first opponent was the reigning under-10 state champion from Florida. The boy grinned wide, flashy, and confident. He made his first move before she even sat down. Sophie took her time. She studied the board. Then, with a quiet click, she mirrored his pawn. Ethan watched from the gallery, heart pounding. Move by move, she dismantled him. Not aggressively, not cruelly, just perfectly. She played like rain falling, consistent, unbothered, impossible to stop. 29 moves later, she offered her hand. The boy refused to shake it. The crowd gasped. Sophie didn't react. She stood, bowed slightly, and walked off the stage. That night, the video went viral. Not the game, the moment. A tiny girl dignified in silence. A boy twice her size refusing to look her in the eye. The comments poured in. Grace under pressure. Teach this girl the world. A queen in sneakers. Ethan found her in the hotel hallway, sitting with her knees to her chest, staring at the floor. You played beautifully, he said. I don't want to be in videos, she whispered. I know. Can I skip tomorrow? He sat beside her. You don't have to do anything, Sophie. She rested her head on his shoulder. But if I don't go, the board will miss me. He smiled. Then we'll go. Her second match was against a 14-year-old prodigy from New York who underestimated her. He attacked too quickly. She waited. He overreached. She trapped. By move 32, the crowd was leaning in. She sees 3 moves deeper than he does, Ben murmured. And she's holding back, Ethan added. At the end, the boy extended his hand. Thank you, he said. Sophie smiled. You played with joy. I liked that. That clip went viral too, but this time, the story was different. The quiet girl teaches a lesson in grace. By the third match, something had changed. Sophie was still calm, still careful, but something inside her had shifted. She no longer looked unsure in the spotlight. She wasn't performing. She was present. And she made space for the game she loved, even in a room that didn't know how to hold silence. Her final opponent was the daughter of a grandmaster. Elegant, strategic. She opened with a hyper-modern defense, forcing Sophie to rethink her early game patterns. For the first time in the tournament, Sophie struggled. Ben leaned forward. She's boxed in. Ethan watched, motionless. Grace closed her eyes. Sophie stared at the board. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out her pencil, and, with permission from the judge, sketched the position. Not on a computer, on paper. She rotated the diagram. Thought. Then, softly, she whispered, Queen to h6. The move was risky, a sacrifice, but it opened a line. 3 moves later, her opponent blinked. And that was all Sophie needed. She didn't win with brute force. She won by creating a position no one else could see. Checkmate in 6. The crowd erupted. Sophie stood, bowed. But this time, she turned to the audience and smiled. That night,
As the train pulled them back toward Boston, Sophie fell asleep with her head on Grace's lap, the chessboard tucked beneath her arm. Ethan stared out the window. "She's changing," he said softly. Grace nodded. "She's learning how to hold her brilliance without being burned by it. She's not afraid anymore." "She was never afraid of the board," Grace said. "She was afraid of being seen." Ethan nodded slowly. "And now?" "She's not just seen," Grace whispered. "She's known." Outside, the city lights flickered back into view, and for the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell smiled without armor. "She already has," he said. The world didn't quiet down when Sophie turned the Grandmaster Academy down. It roared louder. The article was reprinted in 3 national outlets. Her handwritten note was quoted on morning shows. One headline read, "7-year-old chess prodigy turns down elite academy. Says, 'I want to stay home.'" The public reaction split like lightning down a dry tree. Some called it foolish, the waste of a once-in-a-generation mind. Others called it brave, the kind of courage only children still untouched by ambition could hold. But amidst the noise, something unusual happened. Letters began arriving, not from CEOs or sponsors, but from janitors, teachers, nurses, farmers, and even other kids. Handwritten notes, crayon drawings, postcards from dusty towns. They came from as far as Alaska and as near as Roxbury. "Dear Sophie, thank you for reminding me that it's okay to grow slow. Dear Sophie, my son has autism and also hates loud places. You made him feel like a superhero. Dear Sophie, I'm 10. I lost every game last year, but you made me want to try again." Ethan stood in Grace's kitchen one morning, sorting through the mail, his hands trembling as he read one after another. "They're not writing to a prodigy," he said softly. "They're writing to a person." Grace smiled. "Because for the first time, they see one." But not all echoes were kind. Sophie's school changed. Her classmates stared more. Some teachers tried too hard, others too little. One morning, she found a note in her locker. "Go be smart somewhere else." She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She folded it into a tiny square, brought it home, and placed it on the chessboard. That night, she lost 3 matches in a row. Grace noticed. Ethan noticed. But no one pushed, until Sophie spoke up during dinner. "I thought choosing quiet would make the world quieter," she said. Grace reached across the table. "Sometimes the world doesn't know how to handle quiet. But I don't want to hide." Ethan set down his fork. "Then don't. Let's teach them how to hear it." 2 weeks later, Ethan stood in front of a crowd at the Boston Public Library. It wasn't a conference. It wasn't a summit. It was something new. His idea, Sophie's name on the flyer, the listening table, where gifted kids speak without shouting. Sophie sat on stage, cross-legged on a stool, her favorite gray sweater over a checkered dress. She looked out at the dozens of folding chairs, most filled with parents, teachers, and quiet kids holding clipboards like shields. Grace was in the front row. Ethan sat beside her, not as the CEO he once was, but as a man finally learning how to father with his presence, not his power. Sophie began. "I don't always know how to talk to people, but I know how to talk to the board. And sometimes, the board teaches me what to say in real life. Like when people move too fast, I don't chase them. I just wait. Or when someone sacrifices something, I ask why. I don't want to be famous. I want to feel safe. I think a lot of kids want that, even if they're good at something. Silence filled the room. Then, one by one, other kids began to speak. A girl with a stutter said she wrote poems but was afraid to share them. A boy who loved bugs said no one at school let him talk about insects, so he talked to Siri instead. One child whispered from behind their parent's leg, "I build bridges out of straws. Real ones. They hold books." Sophie nodded at each story. Her eyes never left them. She wasn't performing. She was witnessing. And for the first time in their lives, so were they. Afterward, Grace hugged Ethan in the parking lot, and it wasn't awkward. "I never imagined any of this," she said. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But I think we're building something bigger than we ever thought possible." "What do we call it?" she asked. He looked toward the building where Sophie was helping a child set up a travel chessboard near the front steps. "We call it hers," he said. That night, after dinner, Sophie pulled a shoebox from under her bed. It was where she kept things that mattered: rocks shaped like hearts, broken pencils with names, tiny drawings of dragons with chess pieces for wings. She placed one more item inside, the letter from the Grand Master Academy. "I'm not throwing it away," she told Ethan, who stood at the doorway. "Just putting it where it can't speak louder than the board." He crouched beside her. "I kept something too," he said. "Want to see?" He pulled out a folder, old, worn, from his satchel. Inside were letters he had written to his mother, years ago when he was in the academy. Letters never sent. They sat on the floor and read them together. Some were funny, some were angry, some were empty. Sophie leaned her head on his shoulder. "You were lonely." "I was," Ethan said. "She already has," he said. The world didn't quiet down when Sophie turned the Grandmaster Academy down. It roared louder. The article was reprinted in 3 national outlets. Her handwritten note was quoted on morning shows. One headline read, "7-year-old chess prodigy turns down elite academy. Says, 'I want to stay home.'" The public reaction split like lightning down a dry tree. Some called it foolish, the waste of a once-in-a-generation mind. Others called it brave, the kind of courage only children still untouched by ambition could hold. But amidst the noise, something unusual happened. Letters began arriving, not from CEOs or sponsors, but from janitors, teachers, nurses, farmers, and even other kids. Handwritten notes, crayon drawings, postcards from dusty towns. They came from as far as Alaska and as near as Roxbury. "Dear Sophie, thank you for reminding me that it's okay to grow slow. Dear Sophie, my son has autism and also hates loud places. You made him feel like a superhero. Dear Sophie, I'm 10. I lost every game last year, but you made me want to try again." Ethan stood in Grace's kitchen one morning, sorting through the mail, his hands trembling as he read one after another. "They're not writing to a prodigy," he said softly. "They're writing to a person." Grace smiled. "Because for the first time, they see one." But not all echoes were kind. Sophie's school changed. Her classmates stared more. Some teachers tried too hard, others too little. One morning, she found a note in her locker. "Go be smart somewhere else." She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She folded it into a tiny square, brought it home,
and placed it on the chessboard. That night, she lost 3 matches in a row. Grace noticed. Ethan noticed, but no one pushed, until Sophie spoke up during dinner. "I thought choosing quiet would make the world quieter," she said. Grace reached across the table. "Sometimes the world doesn't know how to handle quiet. But I don't want to hide." Ethan set down his fork. "Then don't. Let's teach them how to hear it." 2 weeks later, Ethan stood in front of a crowd at the Boston Public Library. It wasn't a conference. It wasn't a summit. It was something new. His idea, Sophie's name on the flyer, the listening table, where gifted kids speak without shouting. Sophie sat on stage, cross-legged on a stool, her favorite gray sweater over a checkered dress. She looked out at the dozens of folding chairs, most filled with parents, teachers, and quiet kids holding clipboards like shields. Grace was in the front row. Ethan sat beside her, not as the CEO he once was, but as a man finally learning how to father with his presence, not his power. Sophie began. "I don't always know how to talk to people, but I know how to talk to the board. And sometimes, the board teaches me what to say in real life. Like when people move too fast, I don't chase them. I just wait. Or when someone sacrifices something, I ask why. I don't want to be famous. I want to feel safe. I think a lot of kids want that, even if they're good at something." Silence filled the room. Then, one by one, other kids began to speak. A girl with a stutter said she wrote poems but was afraid to share them. A boy who loved bugs said no one at school let him talk about insects, so he talked to Siri instead. One child whispered from behind their parent's leg, "I build bridges out of straws. Real ones. They hold books." Sophie nodded at each story. Her eyes never left them. She wasn't performing. She was witnessing. And for the first time in their lives, so were they. Afterward, Grace hugged Ethan in the parking lot, and it wasn't awkward. "I never imagined any of this," she said. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But I think we're building something bigger than we ever thought possible." "What do we call it?" she asked. He looked toward the building where Sophie was helping a child set up a travel chessboard near the front steps. "We call it hers," he said. That night, after dinner, Sophie pulled a shoebox from under her bed. It was where she kept things that mattered. Rocks shaped like hearts, broken pencils with names, tiny drawings of dragons with chess pieces for wings. She placed one more item inside, the letter from the Grand Master Academy. "I'm not throwing it away," she told Ethan, who stood at the doorway. "Just putting it where it can't speak louder than the board." He crouched beside her. "I kept something too," he said. "Want to see?" He pulled out a folder, old, worn, from his satchel. Inside were letters he had written to his mother, years ago when he was in the academy. Letters never sent. They sat on the floor and read them together. Some were funny, some were angry, some were empty. Sophie leaned her head on his shoulder. "You were lonely." "I was," Ethan said. "You're not now," she whispered. "No," he replied, "because you taught me the silence I was afraid of was actually home." Spring came late to Boston. Cherry blossoms bloomed along the Charles like confetti tossed by careful hands. At the edge of Dorchester, the old community center had a fresh coat of paint, a cracked basketball hoop replaced, and a new sign above its doors, "The Listening Table, a place to think out loud." It wasn't flashy. There were no corporate sponsors, No glass trophy cases, just mismatched chairs, long tables, a chess wall with marker-stained boards, and a quiet room in the back called the thinking room. Sophie's idea. No shoes allowed, blank paper only, soft lights and silence. They opened it on a Saturday. Sophie wore her blue dress, the one with the stitched knight on the sleeve, and Ethan brought a tray of lemon muffins he'd baked himself. Grace laughed when she saw them. "They're lopsided." "They're honest," Ethan said. Dozens came. Parents, kids, teachers, even a retired grandmaster from Connecticut who handed Sophie a folded napkin. Inside was a carved wooden pawn. "Started with this," he said. "Thought you should have it." She smiled and tucked it into her pocket. That afternoon they held a special match, Sophie versus Ethan. No cameras, no audience, just a folding table under the tree in the garden behind the center. Grace sat on the porch steps, sipping tea, watching them like a mother who had already won every prize worth chasing. "You nervous?" Ethan asked. Sophie shook her head. "Are you?" He smiled, terrified. They played slowly, thoughtfully. No pressure, no prize, just two people who once lived in silence, now finding peace in presence. Midway through, Ethan moved his rook too soon. Sophie didn't capitalize. Instead, she waited. "You're giving me a chance?" he asked. She shrugged. "The board is about learning, not punishing." He stared at her. At 7, she had already unlearned what it had taken him a lifetime to forget, that power doesn't live in domination. It lives in compassion. "You win," he whispered, tipping his king. She looked confused. "But I didn't—" "You win," he said again, smiling, "because you stayed yourself." As the sun dipped low, families lingered. Kids played speed chess with juice boxes beside them. A mother in scrubs sat with her son on the steps, watching quietly. A teenage girl with headphones taught a younger boy how to draw checkmate patterns. It wasn't a center for prodigies. It was a home for people who loved thinking, who needed space to bloom without being rushed. That night, Sophie sat in her room writing a new letter. Not to an academy, not to a sponsor, but to her future self. "Dear me, I hope you still love the board. I hope you still lose sometimes, because that means you're still learning. I hope you never play just to prove something. I hope you remember that Grace taught you kindness, Ethan taught you courage, and you taught yourself to stay small when the world screamed big. I'm proud of you. Love, Sophie." She folded it and placed it inside the shoebox, right beside the pawn. Then she turned off the light and slept deeply. For the first time in a long time, the world outside didn't feel so loud. It felt like hers.